The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Who's tonight's guest? I want to remind you of the other lectures in this series coming up. This Sunday, we have a return speaker who is from the Weizmann Institute in Israel, speaking on memories, true and false. And he's really wonderful. And that will be at 11 a.m. on Sunday, 11 till 1. And then we'll also have in February Steven Pinker, who's from MIT, and he'll discuss his research on how the mind creates language. So that program you can find in your brochure. On a lighter note, some of you may be interested, we have a special addition to our program that wasn't in our brochure, and that is on Sunday evening, October 16th. Lily Tomlin and Jane Wagner will appear. And now for tonight. Our guest is the author of the just published The Science of Desire, The Search for the Gay Gene, and the Biology of Behavior. Last July, he made headlines for his groundbreaking discovery of a gene marker for male homosexuality. This launched a furious debate about the profound scientific, social, and ethical issues involved in genetics and genetic research currently going on. In this case, it's linked to behavior. A well-known scientist, our speaker tonight is the chief of the section on gene structure and regulation at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, and we are delighted to have him with us this evening to discuss his remarkable discoveries. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Dean Hammer.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. When the people at Simon & Schuster told me I was going to be speaking at the Y, I assumed it was the YMCA, and that they had me confused with the Village People. But when they told me it was the YMHA, I realized that it was a much different matter. So today what I'd like to talk about is really one of the oldest and biggest mysteries surrounding the human mind, and that is the whole question of nature versus nurture. How much of our thought and our behaviors are influenced by our genes that we inherit at birth, and how much are we influenced by the environment, by our upbringing, and by what happens to us over the course of a lifetime. Most scientists agree now that this idea of nature or nurture is really a false dichotomy, and that most human characteristics are probably influenced by a combination of both. But just saying that is not enough. We need to know what the genes are, what the genes make, and how they operate in our brain. We also need to know what the environmental factors are, what's relevant and what's not relevant. So the particular topic I'm going to talk about is, as you just heard, sexuality, one of the most complex aspects of our behavior and of our thought. I think sexuality is so complex in part because there's so many different facets. For example, there's the matter of frequency. Some people like to have sex morning, noon, and night. For other people, once a week is fine. For others, once a month. And of course, that can change quite a bit over a person's lifetime. Then there's the matter of partners. Some people have tens or hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of sexual partners over the course of their life, and other people never have sex with another human being. And then, of course, there's the matter of attraction. Who are you sexually attracted to? As they say, some men prefer blondes, others prefer brunettes. Some women like men that are intelligent and warm and caring and sensitive, and others just like a nice butt. Of course, one of the most important distinctions is that some people like to sleep with men, and some people like to sleep with women, and some people like to have sex with members of the same gender, and some people like to have sex with members of the opposite gender. And it's that particular aspect, and it's only one aspect of sexuality that's called sexual orientation, that I'll be talking about this evening. So in our laboratory down at the National Institutes of Health, we're particularly interested in the nature side of the equation, and in particular in knowing whether or not there are genes that influences a person's sexual thoughts and sexual behavior. And of course, that's only part of the nature-nurture story, but you really need to understand and to know that part before you can even think about looking at the nurture side in any detail. So the questions that we've been interested in are, first of all, is sexual orientation influenced by genes? If so, we'd like to know where the genes are located and what they make. And ultimately, in the long run, we'd like to know how those genes influence our brain, how they influence our thought. Now, one point I want to emphasize very strongly throughout this lecture is that if genes indeed are involved in sexuality, they only influence sexuality. They don't necessarily determine it. And to give you an example of what I mean by determine versus influence, let's consider a different side of human characteristics, namely eye color and body weight. So we all know that eye color is determined by genes. You're born with a particular eye color. You have it all your life. Doesn't make any difference what you look at or who your parents are or how you're raised up. And the reason for that is that there is a single gene, and that gene makes an enzyme which makes a brown pigment. And if you have one particular form of that gene, like the form here, then you make that enzyme, you make brown pigment, and voila, you have brown eyes. But if you have a very slightly different form of the exact same gene, this little X here has been changed, then you have a different enzyme and you don't make brown pigments, and you'll have either blue or green eyes. So it's quite proper to say that genes determine eye color. There's really virtually nothing else that's involved. But how about if we turn to another body characteristic, in this case, body weight? I'm sure all of you have heard that weight is influenced by genes, and what you usually hear is, oh, he has a high metabolism rate or she has a low metabolism rate. And of course, metabolic rate is influenced by genes. And the reason why is that there are a whole series of different genes that, again, make enzymes that influence how quickly or how slowly you burn up calories. So genes do play a role in body weight, but even the genetic side is more complicated for eye color because now there's not just one gene, but many different genes. And changes in any of those genes can influence exactly how quickly you burn up calories. Of course, you all know that your body weight isn't dependent just on your genes. There are a lot of other factors. For example, how much do you eat? What's your diet? How much do you exercise? Even psychological factors can play a role, and even social and economic factors, which is why, for example, if you go to China and you go to Xi'an, you'll see mostly skinny people. If you go, say, to Hong Kong, you'll see a lot more people that have more body weight. So even for a characteristic like body weight, we see that genes can affect the trait without necessarily determining it. Well, of course, sexuality is a lot more complicated than just body weight, and so you might expect that if genes do play a role, it will be to influence sexuality rather than to determine it. So we don't think the genes act like some light switch that goes up and down between gay or straight. It's more like a sort of subtle dimmer in the room. One of the differences between body weight and sexuality is that it's easy to measure your weight. You just step on a scale. But when it comes to sexuality, measurement is more problematic, and there's a number of tools that can be used. The one we use is something called the Kinsey scale. It was developed by Alfred Kinsey, the pioneering sexuality researcher, back in the 1940s. And all it really is a little measuring stick that goes from 0 to 6. 0 stands for exclusive heterosexuality or attraction to the opposite sex, and 6 stands for exclusive homosexuality or attraction to the same sex. 3, which is right in the middle, stands for bisexuality, equal attraction to both sexes, and then the other numbers are intermediate, somewhere between being straight, gay, and in between. Typically, we ask people about their sexuality in regard to at least 4 different aspects. One is simply self-identification, which is what you call yourself. Many people will say, gee, I'm gay, or I'm straight, or I'm not sure, I'm neither. That's self-identification. Sexual attraction is who you would like to have sex with. Sexual fantasy is who you think about having sex with or who you dream about having sex with. And finally, behavior is who you actually have sex with. Of course, as we all know, these are not exactly correlated, and in particular, fantasy and behavior are often rather different. Nevertheless, in general, these factors tend to cluster together, and so if you want to have some measure of this particular aspect of sexuality, you can just take an average Kinsey factor and learn something about a person's sexual orientation. One of the oldest questions in sexology, the scientific study of sex, is sexual orientation an either-or type of characteristic, or is it more of a graduated response? And there's been a lot of debate about that topic. What I can show you is the responses we got from some of the male subjects in our genetic study of sexual orientation. And this just shows a distribution of the Kinsey scores in a series of men that were studied. The notable feature is that most of the men cluster into either the exclusively or predominantly heterosexual group, this big end of the distribution, or the predominantly or exclusively gay part of the distribution. And relatively speaking, there are few men in the middle in the bisexual range, suggesting that, at least for men and the men that we studied, that sexual orientation is more of an either-or type of trait rather than a graduated type of response. So it's more like eye color, let's say, than like body weight, which of course is very graduated. Of course, I should emphasize this is not necessarily representative of the population as a whole. These are individuals who volunteered to be in a study about human sexuality. Obviously, there's a lot more gay guys in this study than you'd find in the population at large, because that's who we were advertising when we set up the study. So now we have some way to measure sexual orientation. The question is it influenced by genes? The classical way to ask that is to see whether or not sexuality runs in families. Anything that is genetic or genetically influenced will tend to cluster together in families, and it will tend to be passed down from one generation to the next in a predictable fashion. So we did a very simple type of study. We just went and asked a series of gay men what they knew about the sexual orientation of their relatives. And we didn't just ask them about parents and siblings. We also asked about cousins and uncles and great uncles, all up and down the family tree. After we'd collected now several hundred of those family histories, an interesting sort of pattern emerged. And that's shown in these family pedigrees or family trees. The way these work is that the squares are guys and circles are women, and the colored in squares are gay guys. The rest are probably heterosexual. And people that are married together are connected like that, and then these are all their children. The pattern that we found is that most of the gay relatives of gay men tended to cluster on the mother's side of the family. So here's a family where there was a gay guy, and he told us that he had a gay uncle on his mother's side, as well as a gay great uncle who was his mother's brother. And in this particular family, we interviewed not only this individual, but also, I believe, two of his brothers, the uncle and some of the aunts as well. Here's another family, same sort of setup, a gay man who has a gay maternal uncle and a gay great maternal uncle. This is a particularly interesting family that's described in the book. Of course, these scientific diagrams show people as circles and squares. In fact, they all have real lives that we ask about. They were particularly interesting because these two individuals were two men who were well into their 60s and told me a lot about growing up gay back in a time when that was even a great deal more difficult than it is today. This is a family where there are 7 gay men, and when I originally interviewed this individual with the arrow, he said he had these sort of second cousins of some sort, and that they were all common relatives through his great-great-grandfather up here. And right away that told me, gee, maybe this whole idea is wrong. It's not a maternal connection. But actually it turned out when I interviewed his mother and uncle that this great-great-grandfather had married 2 women who were sisters, sequentially, one assumes. And so in fact, all of these relatives shown here are connected through the maternal line because they're connected through sisters or through their mothers. So there was this pattern of transmission or inheritance to the mother's side of the family. Well, of course, we had to look at a lot of family histories, not just a couple. And when we did that and did a statistical analysis, it turned out that the only relatives of gay men that had an increased probability of being gay were their brothers, who had about a 7-fold increased probability, their maternal uncles, about a 3-fold increase, and maternal cousins, specifically through an aunt, also about a 3-fold increase. So this is a relatively weak effect. It's not a simple single gene type of characteristic, but there is a pattern of transmission through the mother's side. So what could that possibly mean? Well, to a geneticist, the simplest interpretation is that there's a gene somewhere on the X chromosome, which is one of the 2 sex chromosomes in humans. The way that it works is that men have one X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Women have 2 X chromosomes. Males always inherit their Y chromosome from their fathers, that's what makes them male, and they inherit their single X chromosome from their mothers. So if there were a gene on the X chromosome that tended to make people gay, then you'd see that gene in a gay man's brothers, in his maternal uncles, and in his cousins, which is exactly the pattern that we found in our family histories. I want to emphasize 2 points. One is that these aren't the only gay men in the world. There are plenty of paternal uncles and other cousins and lots of gay men who have no known gay relatives at all. But statistically, this is the pattern that stuck out. The other point is that this pointed to a gene, but it couldn't prove it because there are lots of things that pass on in families that aren't genetic at all. For example, being Jewish in the religious sense is passed on in families, and it's actually passed on through the mother's side, and yet it's not genetic at all. So this pointed the way to there being a gene, but it certainly couldn't prove it. To actually prove that there might be, or to look for a gene, we had to turn to a different approach, and that's something called DNA linkage analysis. And the basic idea is that if a human characteristic is influenced by a gene, then related individuals who share the characteristic will share the gene more often than expected by chance. A corollary is that they'll share some genetic marker that's close to that gene. The obverse is that if a trait's not influenced by genes, then there just won't be any correlation between a person's genetic makeup and that particular characteristic. The real strength of this method is that it doesn't just rely on family histories. It doesn't just rely on people talking about themselves and their relatives. It actually relies on looking at the DNA itself, which is the inherited material. So it's a physical or molecular measurement rather than simply a historical one. To actually do this type of analysis, you need families because you look at genetic relatedness amongst related people. And you also need something called genetic markers, which are like little signposts that tell you who's got what piece of DNA. The type of families we studied are called SIB pair families, and those are families where there are 2 brothers, and exactly 2 brothers, both of whom are gay. And the idea is that if there's some gene on the X chromosome that's next to some marker, then pairs of gay brothers will usually share the same marker, because that will be next to the gene that influenced their sexual orientation. And we say that those are concordant pairs or pairs that share. And there will be relatively few pairs that don't share the marker, because if the marker is next to the gene, basically they need to share it. So that sets up a real simple hypothesis, which is that if there is a so-called gay gene, then gay brothers will share markers more often than not. There'll be more concordant pairs than discordant pairs. If there is no such gene, then there won't be any such bias in the ratios. Now, this particular type of analysis is a good one for 2 especially important reasons. One is that false negatives don't count. And here, when I say a false negative, I mean someone who has a homosexual orientation, but who chooses to identify themselves as heterosexual. And the reason that they don't count is that they'll never be in the study. So, for example, consider the case of J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, as you probably read, there's a certain amount of question about his sexuality or lack of question. But he wouldn't bothered this study for the simple reason that it would be very unlikely that J. Edgar Hoover would read the Washington Blade, see an advertisement for gay brothers, come into the NIH, and tell me that, gee, I'm gay and I'd like to be in your study. So he simply won't be counted. The opposite's also true, and that is that false positives are probably going to be pretty rare. False positive is someone who has a heterosexual orientation, but who chooses to identify as gay. And of course, the reason for that is the continuing stigmatization. When we were first starting this experiment was actually back in the Bush administration, and then there was the election, and Clinton got in, and some of my colleagues came up and said, gee, you know, now Clinton's in, gays are going to have so many advantages, they're going to have tax breaks, special rights, this is really going to mess up your study. But it didn't actually turn out that way. All right, the other thing that we need are markers. Markers are just little bits of DNA that are different between different people. And fortunately, there's a gigantic enterprise called the Genome Project, the aim of which is to determine all of the DNA sequences that make up our genes. And one of the byproducts of that is that there are now thousands and thousands of markers sprinkled all over our genomes. This just shows some of the markers on the X chromosome. There are actually more than 1,000 different markers now. So as a result of that massive effort, we have an easy way to detect who shares DNA segments and who has different DNA segments. The actual experiment then was we got 40 pairs of gay brothers. We took their DNA. We analyzed them for a series of 21 different markers spanning the X chromosome. And we asked the question, is there any region where the gay brothers share markers more often than expected just by chance? And this shows the result of that. It's a roadmap of the X chromosome from one tip to the other tip. And what you're looking at is the probability that brothers share this region more often than expected by chance. If this graph goes below the 0 line, that means the probability is very low and there's no sharing. But if the line goes above the vertical axis here, that means that there's an increased probability of sharing. And what we found is that over most of the whole chromosome, there was no sharing. But there was one tiny region at the very tip of the long arm that's called XQ28, where there was more sharing than expected by chance. And when we plotted out those results, the LOD score was 4. It's a logarithmic score. It means that there's 10,000 to 1 odds that this region is linked to sexual orientation in this population of men. So let me just show the same result in a little simpler way. This shows the probability that brothers share this tiny region of the chromosome called XQ28. What you see is that gay brothers have about an 80% chance of sharing that region, whereas if you just take a collection of random brothers, most of whom are heterosexual, there's just an average 50-50 chance of sharing that. So the interpretation of that result is that there's a gene somewhere in this small region that is somehow influencing the sexual orientation of these men. Now, this region of the chromosome is tiny in the sense that it's only about 1/10 of 1% of all of our DNA. But it's still very large in that it's big enough to have several hundred different genes. And we still have a lot more work to do, a lot more interviews to do, a lot more DNA samples to analyze until we can actually narrow down exactly which gene we're talking about. And that's something that's going on in my lab now and that we hope to accomplish in the not too distant future. Well, this was pretty much the way the science was as of a year ago. At that time, there was, as was mentioned, a lot of controversy and criticism, some of it scientific and some of it political. Let me address some of the scientific issues first. One thing that people frequently said is, well, this has only been shown one time. It may be a fluke. Maybe it will disappear. Of course, if you're going to do something first, it pretty much has to be the first time. But we've taken that very seriously. And in the last year, we have simply repeated this experiment over on a new set of 32 families, I believe. And the take-home message is that we get the same result. More gay brothers share this region than do random brothers or heterosexual brothers. Another criticism was that we really looked only at gay men in this study. We didn't bother to look at their heterosexual brothers. Who knows, maybe for a variety of reasons. But since then, we've looked at several families in which there were straight brothers who were willing to participate. And basically what we found is that most of those straight brothers have the opposite region of the chromosome than their gay brothers. So like, here's a family, two gay guys, they have the colored in chromosome, and their straight brother has the opposite chromosome. Another family, same deal. Here's an interesting family where there are some twins, actually. The two gay brothers have the same chromosome. Their definitely heterosexual brother has the opposite chromosome. And a bisexual brother, in this case, had the same chromosome as his two gay siblings. Now we've looked at about 11 different families, and this pattern has held up. Most of the time, the gene that's shared by the gay brothers is the opposite in the heterosexual brother. And that's actually important because it suggests that this gene doesn't just make people gay, it can also make people straight. So the whole idea of calling it a gay gene is probably wrong. It's just as much a straight gene or a sexual orientation locus. There was one other big problem with our initial work, and that is that we only looked at guys. We left out the other 50% of the population. We left out women. We've been doing a lot of work together with Dr. Angela Patitucci, who's in my lab, and the results are coming out quite interesting and in many ways very different than what we found in men. One difference is that if you just look at sexual orientation in a group of women, these are some of the women we studied, there are a lot more women who are somewhere in the middle. Again, this is very much a non-random distribution, and many of the women, as you can see, are lesbian because they were recruited that way, but it's still quite remarkable that there are so many women who have some degree of bisexuality. And indeed, many of the women who identify as exclusively heterosexual, in fact, sometimes have fantasies or attractions to other women, and many of the women who identify as definitely lesbian have attractions or fantasies about men. So there is much more of a graduation, there's much more diversity in female sexuality. And there's also much more fluidity. Many women change their sexuality once or twice or more times over the course of a life, sometime on into the later years of life. We've also looked for genetic markers in families in which there are two sisters who are lesbians. So far we haven't found anything. Certainly there's nothing on the X chromosome that we've been able to detect. So just to summarize the scientific part then, what we really found is that when you look at gay brothers, they share XQ28 more often than expected by chance. That's true in two different studies. It seems to be holding up. That means there is a gene influencing being gay in that region. If you look at their straight brothers, they have that gene less often than expected by chance. The pattern's just reversed. So the gene is probably influencing heterosexuality as well. But when we look at lesbian sisters or just random siblings, there's no particular sharing of this region, indicating that that part of the chromosome doesn't affect their sexuality. So this is probably the most direct physical evidence to date that there are genes that influence people's sexuality. It's not true for everybody. Even in the population we studied, there were a lot of gay men who didn't share this particular region. And it's certainly also the case that there are heterosexual men who do share this region. So just like we thought at the beginning, the genes are acting to influence sexuality without actually determining it. The question that then arises is, well, if there are these type of genes, what exactly are they doing? And we don't know yet. We won't know until we've actually isolated the gene, but let me just sketch out two of the possibilities. The simplest or the most direct is that the gene's acting directly on the brain and that it's somehow hardwiring it for people to be attracted to men or attracted to women. I'm sure many of you know that back in 1991, Simon LeVay reported that there was a difference in one very tiny region of the hypothalamus that seemed to be different in gay men and heterosexual men, and also different in men and women on average. So it's conceivable that the genetic element that we're looking at is some sort of protein or enzyme that makes that region grow or not grow in a particular way. In that case, the genes would be acting in a very direct fashion on sexuality. Of course, that's just a speculation. We have to have a lot more knowledge before we can make any sort of such connection. A lot more work needs to be done on the brain as well. But I want to emphasize that that's not the only possibility, and that the genes could be acting in a much more indirect fashion. For example, they could be influencing not who you're sexually attracted to, but how you react to your own sexual feelings. For example, in our culture, in order to identify yourself as being gay, you have to not just be attracted to people of the same gender, you also have to have a certain degree of self-reliance, a certain degree of independence, a certain degree of willingness to say, well, I don't care what other people or what the group thinks, this is the way I feel. And perhaps genes could be influencing something like that. So I just wanted to read a short passage from the book that describes, in a sense, how I got interested in that idea. And it's about two of the brothers who were in the study. They were called George and Albert. George answered the phone on a summer day in 1992 and gave me directions to the house he shared with a brother. He added, as a sort of caution, that his brother was kind of conservative. I followed the directions and pulled up in front of a 1950s ranch-style house in a quiet residential neighborhood in a small southern hamlet. The grass was green and well-tended, and pink roses swayed alongside the white picket fence. I rang the bell and was greeted by a man who was naked from the waist up. Two shiny metal rings hung heavily from his pierced nipples, and there were thinner rings through his lip and eyebrow. His torso was busily tattooed, and when he turned to lead me into the living room, I noticed that they extended across his back and included a German cross and a wreath of snakes and bullwhips. "You must be the less conservative brother," I ventured. This was George, and he was not a conventional guy. At 13, he said he seduced his pastor. At 18, he left home for New York to begin a career as a stripper and a hustler. When I asked him about his total sexual partners over his lifetime, he said he thought about it quite a lot, and including every contact at bathhouses, sex clubs, and backroom bars, he figured it was 10,000 to 20,000 partners, including several hundred women he'd slept with for money. When I ran the standard questionnaire on him, including demographics such as educational level, I was impressed to hear he had gotten a master's in New York. Not a master's, he corrected me. A master. I've got a master in New York. When Albert appeared, I thought he was George's accountant, or maybe the piano teacher rather than his other brother. Prim and proper, Albert said he had a 9-to-5 job, went to church on Sundays, and was the one responsible for keeping the yard so neat. The one thing Albert shared with his brother was an attraction to men, which he first recognized at age 5. For the next 22 years, however, he did everything possible to deny those feelings to himself and to others. When he fell in love with a college classmate and was rejected, he sought solace in becoming a Jehovah's Witness. When his homosexual attraction still wouldn't go away, he joined the Marines to prove he was a real man. Only after an emotional breakdown, which led to counseling from a sympathetic psychiatrist, did Albert begin to accept his sexuality. And as a gay man, he still struggled to lead a conventional life, and following the breakup of a 6-year relationship, he remained chaste because he preferred a monogamous relationship. According to the definitions in the personality test we use, and this is where we're talking about self-reliant, Albert was group-oriented, while George was the very picture of self-reliance, insensitive to, if not downright disdainful of, social norms. When we tested their DNA, we found that Albert and George not only had different personalities, they had different versions of XQ28. Since both men were gay but had different versions of XQ28, perhaps the gene was influencing something related to their psychological adjustment to their homosexual orientation rather than to their homosexuality per se. For example, during childhood, they both developed gay fantasies for whatever reason, but only George had a version of XQ28 that led him to indulge in those fantasies. Albert, on the other hand, had different DNA and suppressed his gay fantasies to be more, quote, normal. This analysis is purely a guess, but it suggests an interesting way of looking how an inherited personality trait unrelated to sex might influence sexual orientation. And there's really this great cartoon from The New Yorker which tells you the same idea, but stresses the idea that such genes might not only influence people who are gay, but people who are straight as well. So there's one other scientific mystery I wanted to get into just a bit, and that is the question of if they're gay genes, how could they have evolved? Another New Yorker cartoon. Of course, the problem is, I don't know why that's so funny, but it really is. Well, I guess that's why it's in the New Yorker. So the problem is, gee, if you're gay and you're not attracted to women, you're probably going to have fewer kids than your heterosexual counterpart. Of course, gay men most assuredly do have children, but you might expect it to be less. So if that were controlled by a gene, you might expect the gene to sort of wither away and to die out. Well, the answer to that from an evolutionary perspective has to be that the gene has some advantage. And it could be something like gay men helped their relatives to raise up their children, perhaps some special talent or intelligence. The idea that I like most right now is that this gene might be doing the same thing in men as it is, or might be doing the same thing in women as it is in men, namely making them attracted to men sexually. So if you had a gene that made people attracted to men, and you're a guy and you have the gene, then you'll be gay and perhaps have fewer children. But if you're a woman and you have that gene, you'll be really attracted to men and perhaps more likely to have children. This works out really neat for genes on the X chromosome because remember, women have 2 copies of the gene, men only have 1. So the gene would only have to be half as effective in making women have more sex and have more babies as it would be effective in making men not have babies. Just a speculation, but I think it gives you a flavor for how genes can be preserved in populations and even can expand in populations, even though it's not obvious how they do that. If all of that is right, there's something really interesting about this, and that is that the prediction is that societies that are very open about homosexuality, where gay men don't have to marry, will see this so-called genetic form of homosexuality die out. But societies that are particularly repressive and that urge men to marry and have children no matter what their orientation is should actually see the gene flourish, something that might be of political interest. Well, now I wanted to talk finally about some of the social and ethical and legal and moral implications of all this research. And this last cartoon shows something that was talked about a great deal when our research was announced, that people continue to talk about, and that I myself am particularly concerned about. And that is the concern that if we do find a gay gene or even gay genes, that information might be abused in the worst possible way. And specifically that it might be used to develop some sort of gay gene test which could be used to discriminate against people. For example, in the workplace, in getting into the military, and so on. Or that one could even develop an amniocentesis test, and that mothers might actually abort a fetus if they thought it had an increased probability of being gay. I think that is truly a horrendous possibility. I also think that it's not going to happen, and I think that for 2 reasons. The first is that from everything I've told you, we know that there is no single gay gene, and that there never will be an accurate test. This is not going to be like Down syndrome. It's not going to be like sickle cell anemia. There will never be a test that's accurate. In fact, there'll never be a test that's more than 30 or 40% accurate on average, and probably will be much less than that. So for that practical reason, I really don't believe that there's going to be widespread testing or widespread amniocentesis. But on the other hand, I realize that there are a lot of unscrupulous people in the world. There are greedy people in the world. There are people who might want to try and develop such a test, no matter how flawed, and use it to influence people or to try to test people. And I think that I and other scientists are concerned about that, and that we need to do a lot of work to make sure that that doesn't occur. For myself, I work with gay and lesbian groups who are concerned about this issue. I work both medical groups and scientific and technical groups. I work with groups like the Ethical, Legal, Social Initiative Group of the Human Genome Project, designed specially to consider this type of ethical questions. And I really believe that as time develops, we are going to be able to develop guidelines and regulations and, as necessary, legislation to make sure that this genetic testing and genetic manipulation doesn't occur. I must say that if this work were going on just about sexuality, I'd be worried, because there have been many terrible past abuses of technology against gay people. But it's not going on just about sexuality. People are finding genes every day for all sorts of human characteristics, whether it be intelligence, musical ability, or whatever. And I believe that as long as sexual orientation is kept firmly within that group of normal human variations and attributes, that we are going to develop the necessary policy to escape that. There is, I'm not going to have the lights back up, if that's possible. There is another misconception or another myth that came out from our research that I want to address, and that is the idea that, gee, if you discover a biological or genetic basis for homosexuality, somehow that is going to eradicate homophobia. And if people just understood why people are gay, then they wouldn't be so prejudiced. I wish that that were true, but the fact of the matter is that homophobia is a phobia. A phobia is an irrational fear. And irrational fears are sadly immune to the power of science and to the power of logic. So I don't think this type of research is going to eradicate homophobia. I do think it can play a rather specific role in changing attitudes and in combating one of the most frequent myths about homosexuality, which is that it is a perverse, chosen lifestyle, and that people decide to be gay the same way you decide what to eat for breakfast or what tie to put on before you go to work. Clearly, something that's influenced by genes is not simply a choice. It may not be purely biological, but it certainly is not purely a choice. It turns out that because of a peculiarity in American law, this actually has some legal impact. And that is that even though all Americans have the same rights, some people get laws taking away their rights scrutinized more carefully than do other groups. And one of several tests for such heightened scrutiny is the property of immutability. That is, traits that are not easy to change, like skin color, are more difficult to legislate against or to discriminate against than are traits that are freely chosen by people. It really is a peculiarity of American constitutional law. It doesn't sound completely right to me, but that's the way the Supreme Court has decided it. And so this type of evidence obviously is a strong argument in favor of some degree of immutability for sexual orientation. And I know for me, one of the most gratifying and one of the most interesting experiences of having done this research was being called out to Colorado last year, where they were fighting against Amendment 2 and testifying in court there about the immutability of sexual orientation. That battle, of course, was won, but it was won on the strictly constitutional grounds. And the judge found that though all the credible evidence supports a biological component for sexual orientation, he was very careful, must have been a scientist, that was really irrelevant to the case and that the constitutional grounds alone were enough. But this is not going to be the end of that case, because the large majority now of gay and lesbian civil rights cases do involve this particular argument. So it may play some role there. I think that in all the talk about the possible dangers of our work and the fears of eugenics and of genetic manipulation, that people have largely continued to overlook what I consider to be a much graver danger, and that is the danger of not studying sexuality at all. If you look at the way our research system is set up, we spend remarkably little money and remarkably little time on studying human sexuality. At the sort of level of research that I do at the genetic level, there are 10 times more people studying the eye color of fruit flies than there are studying sexuality. And to me, that's a very disturbing thing. And the reason I think it's disturbing is that we need to know more about sexuality, not just to understand how the mind works, but to protect our health. If you look at what happened during the whole AIDS epidemic and the continuing epidemic in the United States, I think that's clear. Because when the AIDS epidemic started, and it was seen almost exclusively in gay men, the first thing people really needed to know was how many gay men are there in the United States. And the answer that came back was that nobody knew. We still don't know, for that matter. And the reason why is that the last person who really studied it was Kinsey, and he lost his grants, he lost his respectability, he was very vehemently criticized. As the epidemic continued to spread, it became clear that it was being sexually transmitted. And so another question arose, and that is, what exactly do gay men do sexually? What do they do in bed together from a scientific viewpoint? And again, the answer came back from the scientists and from the government that we don't know, and we're not going to give you any money to study that. In more recent time, as we've come to know that the main route, sexual route in gay men, is through one particular activity, namely anal intercourse, more pressing and more practical questions have arisen, like how important is anal intercourse? What's the best way to get people to practice safe sex? Should you advise them not to have anal intercourse at all, or to use condoms, or should you perhaps use different strategies for different groups and different types of men? And again, the answer that's come back from the government and from the Congress and even from scientists is, we don't know, we don't want you to find out, and even if you do find out, we're not going to use that information in an effective way. All those we don't knows, we don't want you to knows, have really added up to a lot of lives that have been lost. And we do know from the experience in other countries, Australia for example, that research makes a difference and that education makes a big difference. And so I think when I look at our research in that perspective as part of understanding the overall flow of human sexuality, that we have a lot more to fear from our ignorance than we do from new knowledge. Thank you. I would be delighted to take questions from the audience. Please. Right. We haven't been studying transgendered behavior at all. I have seen a few studies which suggest that there's not much genetic influence on that. And of course, that's much less frequency than just being gay. So I think it's a really interesting question, but it probably has more to do with the formation of gender than of sexuality. And those are certainly related, but they're not necessarily, they aren't the same, I should say. Certainly not very much formal research. It's hard enough to get support to study homosexuality, much less transgender behavior. Well, in Australia, the main keys have been really massive public education. Condoms are advertised every place. When you go into a drugstore, they're not hidden someplace. They're right up in the front with everything, you know, with toothpaste and so on. And also, it was mainly a matter of education. And the main difference in the epidemic there and here is that the sort of second bump of sexual transmission that we're seeing now is completely absent in Australia. And really, you know, our cultures are rather similar, Australia and the United States. I think the main difference has simply been a matter of education. Yes, there's no question that people do change over the course of their life. For men, those large changes are not all that frequent, at least in our experience. For a woman, they're much more frequent. And, you know, I don't know if that's a difference in socialization or an underlying biological difference, but there certainly are people who shift more often, in our experience, in women than in men. I'll give you an example. I interviewed a woman who was some gay guy's aunt, actually, and she was about 66, 67. She'd been married twice. She really liked heterosexual sex. She liked having sex with both her husbands. And so I gave her all the Kinsey scales, and she was 0, 0, 0, 0. And then before she left, she said, well, you know, there's one thing you didn't ask me, and that's about the future. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, I'm 60-something now. My second husband has passed away. I'm still active. And I don't know if you've noticed, but if you look at the men in my age range, they're really pretty pitiful. So I assume my next partner will be a woman. You usually don't hear like 67-year-old guys saying that. You know, you just... Yeah, please. Yeah, in fact, those two little slides I showed you, the Kinsey distribution and the little gene sharing slide, are actually the result of studying, oh gosh, now over 500 women. We've actually studied more women than we have men. We've done a lot of markers. We've done a lot of family histories. Some of that's going to be published in the next 6 months, I hope, if the reviewers like it. And, you know, the difference is we just haven't found anything simple, and maybe because there's not anything real easy to find. We are real lucky with men. When you find something on the X chromosome, it makes life 23-fold easier than if it's someplace else. So we're going to continue looking, and we're going to continue researching. And if our research leads us into more social and environmental or family factors, then I think that's what Dr. Patitucci will be looking at. Please. Well, there's a lot of familiality of same-sex orientation in women. That is, the sisters of lesbians have a, I don't know, 6 or 7-fold increased chance of identifying themselves as lesbian. But we just see this sort of obvious pattern that we saw in men that really looks genetic. And the problem with just seeing things cluster in families, that can be genetic, but it can be completely non-genetic also. And so it's just as likely that what we saw was that women who grow up in an environment where being lesbian is okay or permissible are more likely to identify themselves that way. Yeah. Right. Right. Homozygous, right, exactly. That's a good point, and actually that would fit that beautifully. The problem is we don't actually see any linkage on the X chromosome, and that distribution I showed was very much an artificial one because we sort of went out and asked for lesbians and asked for women in women's studies groups, and the sort of bump in the middle is a very artificial one. I think what other scientists have seen is that if you look at the range of Kinsey scales with women, it's highest in the heterosexual range, and then it just tapers off all the way through, all the way out. So, yeah, please. Yeah. Well, the fact that you just said is very true and is well documented by, sexologists. Nobody knows the reason for that. I have an evolutionary reason, which is that, so what men want to do evolutionary-wise is that they want to inseminate as many women as possible because they got the little tiny gametes, their sperm, and they got jillions of them, and the best way for them, for their genes to reproduce is to have lots of kids. So a guy sees 2 women together, he figures, first of all, I'm bigger than the other woman, I can push her aside. Second of all, I don't have to fool around with foreplay. And third of all, I got 2 chances, which is better than 1 chance. So this is an evolutionary genetic turn-on that gets translated into, that's why men like that so much. Whereas women from an evolutionary viewpoint are saying, I've only got a couple of eggs, and if I get one of them fertilized, it's going to be 9 months that I'm out of commission, and then another 16 years of taking the brats to piano lessons and everything. So I got to be real careful what I do with the eggs, and the idea of seeing 2 guys having sex together is just, it's not a turn-on. They'd rather see somebody that can take care of their kids or whatever. It sounds a bit like a sexist sort of attitude, and it is, but it may also have some basis in biology. No, this is what other people think, not me, of course. Yes, somebody's laughing and raising their hand. Right. Yeah. I agree totally that the way sexuality is expressed varies tremendously from one culture to another. And often when I talk to cultural anthropologists who study being gay in different cultures, I ask them if they wouldn't be interested in collaborating, and helping in this type of research. So far I haven't gotten many takers. But the other thing, it's not clear how non-binary sexuality is in some of those cultures. Like I talked to Walter Williams, who writes a lot about. He wrote *The Spirit and the Flesh* about same-sex relations in Native American culture. And so that's a whole real different setup than we have. And yet he'll also say, in a lot of Native American cultures, there are gay guys and there are straight guys, and everyone knows the difference. So I'm not clear. The same with South American cultures. You get different reports from different people, and I'm not sure how graded it is. But I agree, it would be real interesting to expand this to other cultures, and if you have contacts in other societies or cultures or studied that, I'm always interested in doing that. Hopefully someplace kind of tropical and nice. Yes, ma'am. Right. So the question is, obviously everything's not genetic. What is the role of nurture exactly? And we certainly don't know. I think the old psychological theories, there are really two forms. One is that it's interaction with parents, and the classical version of that is domineering mother, distant father for gay men. That hasn't held up very well. When you do that study and cross-culturally, that completely falls apart. When you look at cultures where people aren't so freaked out about being gay, the distant father thing really disappears, which suggests that what happens in our society is that when a dad figures out his little kid is going to be gay and wants to be close to him, that freaks him out and makes him distant. We asked sort of standard questions about relationships between parents and children, and a lot of people gay men are closer to their mothers than their fathers, but so are a lot of their straight brothers. Children in general are closer to their mothers. Other than that, the other theory was sort of behavioral theory, where if somebody's first sexual interaction is with a male and it's pleasurable, then they're more likely to turn out gay. And again, there's really not much evidence to support that. So I also talk with psychiatrists and with behavioral people all the time, asking what are the right questions that we should be asking, what should we be looking for? And the answers are pretty fuzzy. So I'm not sure. I'm sure there's something there, but I don't know what it is. Yeah. No, we've actually run that analysis between this genetic region and the number of sexual partners over the lifetime, and there's no correlation at all. Some of you may have seen there was a Time article a couple of weeks ago. It was like, infidelity, is it genetic? Or infidelity is genetic. Well, it's not this gene. I tend to doubt that that's very much influenced by genes. I think that's one of those characteristics that probably is very much influenced by social structure and by experiences over a lifetime. I don't know of actually any formal genetic studies like on twins on monogamy versus the opposite of monogamy. Yes. Right. So right now there are two groups who are getting into this area. One in Canada who are just beginning to collect families, and then there's another group at the National Institute of Mental Health where they're just beginning their study now. They're setting up for it. So I hope that there will be additional groups that study this. It's problematic because it would be difficult to get funding in the outside for this type of research. I was fortunate to be working at the Cancer Institute. We also work on Kaposi sarcoma and AIDS. But by contrast, there's a huge amount of research being done on manic depression and schizophrenia and psychiatric illnesses because people want to cure those. So I'm hoping that other people are completely independent groups will be replicating our results, but we're still waiting for them to do the experiments. Yeah, so the data is that about 50% of the identical twins of a gay man are also gay. And that's a real interesting number because it means that's much higher than in the population at large. So there's something genetic going on. But it also means it's no more than 50% altogether. And that number may actually be exaggerated. It may be closer to 30 or 40%. So that kind of gives you the range of possibilities for how important genetics are in sexual orientation. By the way, those twins were all raised together, so that's actually the effects of genes plus a common environment is no more than 50%, which means there's 50% unaccounted for, and it's not just the way moms treat their kids because they got the same mom. Most moms treat identical twins, I think, pretty much the same. Identical twins have identical genes with some tiny little variations, but by and large, they have identical genes. So identical twins are truly genetic clones of each other. And if something's influenced by genes, it should be just the same in identical twins, or to the extent that the genes are important. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, for the males, it turns out that if your dad is gay, that there can't possibly be transmission along the X chromosome because your dad can't give that to you. For other genes on other chromosomes, that is very interesting. And we've actually been doing some family studies now on the children of gay parents. It's really an interesting topic. It's one that has some social implications as well because of the whole issue of custody and adoption of children by gay people. Yeah. So, not yet. That's like, first we do the brothers, then we do the sisters, then we do brother-sister combinations. And the family stuff tells us there's like, that usually gay males and lesbians are in different families, but there's certainly many families where there's also a gay brother and sister. And we'd like to study that eventually. We'd like to work things out more with women first. Right. So one of the oldest ideas was that the level of testosterone, which is the male hormone, will influence male sexual orientation. And what we know for sure is that levels in the adult are completely uncorrelated. There was some old research that said they were correlated, but it turned out to be wrong. There was actually a sad sort of incident involving that, which is that after those reports were made, there was reported to be at least some doctors that injected gay men with testosterone with the idea that that would make them heterosexual. And what it actually did was make them extremely horny gay men. Bad science, bad medicine, not good. Yeah. Please. Right. Right. Well, the question of how many gay men are there in America is tricky. It depends on exactly what you define as a gay man. If you ask the question, are you gay? Just like that, basically. Do you identify as gay? The best numbers are somewhere between 2 and 4%, probably closer to 2. If you ask somebody, well, have you ever had a sexual thought about another guy, then it's a lot higher than that. In our own research, basically what we do is we study guys that really identify as gay on all aspects. And certainly many of the gay men have experimented with heterosexual relationships in high school and college because there's a lot of social pressure to do that, but have usually pretty much settled on their orientation sometime in their 20s, something like that. Please. Right. So, as I answered before, there are other groups that are beginning to repeat our work and do DNA linkage analysis on gay families. We don't have any results from them yet at all. There certainly has been no refutation based on evidence because no one's repeated the experiment, so there can't be. There have been scientific criticisms. The main one was that we didn't study heterosexual brothers. We've addressed that now because we've done that. And the other one was exactly what you mentioned, which is that it hasn't been repeated yet. So unfortunately, I can't independently repeat the results myself because I'm me and my lab is my lab, and there's nothing I can do about that. I can encourage other people to repeat the results. I've certainly provided one of those laboratories at NIMH with all of our instruments and with the particularities of our design. I'm going to be talking with the fellow who's going to be doing that work shortly about exactly how we do interviews and so on. And so, if we were studying Alzheimer's disease, this result will have been replicated in a week because there's hundreds of people that have hundreds of families with Alzheimer's disease. But there's nobody else who's collected gay families the way we have yet. So we're hoping that there will be a repeat. I should also say that actually in genetics, one way of being sure of things is to repeat the results. The best way, though, is to isolate the gene. And when you isolate the gene and you can see significant correlations between functional alleles and phenotype, then it's pretty clear that you've done the right thing. Yeah. Yes. Right. True. Oh, absolutely, and I would encourage that. The thing is, I have to encourage the National Institutes of Health to feel the same way. The difference between breast cancer and homosexuality is that we spend about $3 billion a year on breast cancer. Oh, write to Dr. Harold Varmus or write to Donna Shalala, who's the head of the Health and Human Services, and encourage basic studies of sexuality at the NIH. I've tried to get some more attention paid to this at the NIH, but, I'm just a researcher. That would be the best way, I think, to do is to go through the NIH and the Department of Health and Human Services. I do think it is a more urgent issue, and perhaps it's not bad that there's not a huge amount of funding. I think there could be a little bit more. I think there should be, forget about the genetics and what we're doing, I think there should be more basic studies of sexuality in general. And I think that, there's often an attempt to separate sexuality and what's okay to study, which is health-related and reproduction-related, and what's not okay to study, which is the basic stuff like what people do and why they do it. And I think that's a false distinction. Congress tries to make that distinction. I think it's not an effective one. It doesn't work in real life. Please. Well, I started out 23 years ago in science, and it hadn't really struck my mind at that time. It really came up for a variety of reasons. I basically had a midlife crisis, and instead of getting divorced or buying a new sports car, I decided to change my work a little bit. That's a kind of oversimplified version. But it's not something that anybody pushed me into or that I was assigned to. It was something I was interested in. Oh, most of it is unsequenced, so we don't know the exact way it's spelled out. All of it has been charted in the sense that we know where all the chromosomes are and we have markers for all of them. So that, in fact, a routine procedure now in genetics is if you're interested in a trait, you search the entire genome for the gene. So I don't know if I'm making myself clear. It's like we have a map of the United States and you can see all the interstates on it, but we don't have detailed geographic surveys showing house by house in every single town in the United States. Only about 2 or 3% of the entire genome has actually been chemically determined at the single base level. Yes, that's correct. Right. So the way you judge whether or not a study is significant is not by the number of people, but by the statistical probability that the result arose by chance. And with 40 pairs, we got a pretty good probability, better than 99%, actually better than 99.75%. Actually, very frequently in genetic studies, genes are located by the study of a single family, a single large family or two families. So the statistics are reasonably good. Of course, it'll be better to study more families, and that will go on. But I actually think it would be a bad idea to start by trying to understand gayness in every different country and society in the world, because it may turn out that what makes you gay in the United States is a little bit different than what makes you gay in, say, Alaska, because the cultures are very different. And when you do science, the whole idea is to start with the simple and then work towards the complex. So I think, actually, if I had my preference, I would study, Finnish people that were isolated in one little hamlet for the last 200 years. In fact, we just studied sort of a typical collection of Americans. Well, I was subpoenaed, and I told them that I could not say that being gay is genetic or that it's completely unchangeable, because that's not what the research shows, and that the research was still preliminary, and that it had only been done once, it had not been replicated, and there was a lot of work to do. And nevertheless, they felt that it was one point in their favor in what is really a series of arguments. And they said it would be useful, and I took the lawyer's advice. The lawyer was actually a former Supreme Court justice in the state of Colorado, so I think she, I thought that she knew what she was talking about. It turns out that actually gay rights lawyers have been making this argument for a long time, but they've been making it on what psychiatrists and psychologists tell them, which is that sexual orientation is set up pretty early in life, and it's a deeply ingrained part of a person's makeup. So it wasn't like this is a completely new argument that, there was one genetic experiment published and suddenly it changed the law. It's part of a long tradition of these cases. And so I felt if they were interested that it was a good idea to go. Well, thank you again.
I just want to thank Dean Hammer for his very informative talk. Thank you for coming. He will be available for questions, and there will be a book selling and signing right outside this hall, so we look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.